A ruthless billionaire abandoned his sick black son in the deadly forests, not knowing the forest would raise the boy into the very man who would one day destroy him, without lifting a finger. They said no child could survive a single night out there. No medicine, no protection, no immune system strong enough to fight what lived beneath those trees. But that night, a trembling boy was left behind, and a man drove away believing his greatest mistake had been buried forever. What Elias Thorne didn't know was that the forest was watching, and it remembers everything. Stay with this story until the end, because the final moment doesn't end in revenge. It ends in something far worse. It ends in silence. The kind of silence that follows a man into every room he enters, every award he accepts, every mirror he tries to avoid. You think you know how this story ends. You think the abandoned boy comes back with fury in his eyes and vengeance in his heart. But what if I told you the real punishment was never about what was done to Elias Thorne? What if I told you the real punishment was what he had to watch his son become without him? Why would a father abandon his own child? What kind of man trades his son's life for applause, for sympathy, for a cleaner public image that makes investors feel comfortable signing checks? And how did a boy with a failing immune system survive 25 years without hospitals, without expensive drugs, without the help of the very medical empire his father built on the backs of suffering people? Most of all, what happens when the child you erased from your life returns, not broken but healed, not desperate but powerful, and no longer needing anything from the man who was supposed to protect him? This is not a story about monsters hiding in the shadows. There are no villains twirling their mustaches in dark rooms. This is a story about choices. Small choices that seem reasonable in the moment. Choices dressed up in logic and necessity. Choices that a man can justify to himself in the quiet hours of the night when nobody else is listening. And this is a story about the quiet punishment that follows those choices, sometimes years later, sometimes decades later, when a man finally has to look at what he threw away and realize it became everything he ever wanted to be. Before we go deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you are watching from right now. Whether you are in Texas or Toronto, Lagos or London, we want to hear from you. This community is built on real people with real stories, and your voice matters here. And if you are new to this channel, take a moment to hit that subscribe button so you never miss another story. We do not just tell stories here. We hold up mirrors, and the reflection might just change how you see everything. Elias Thorne was not born cruel. Nobody is born cruel. Cruelty is something that grows in the spaces where other things should have been planted. Love should have been planted there. Patience should have been planted there. The ability to sit with failure and not let it define you should have been planted there. But in the soil of Elias Thorne's childhood, only one seed was ever watered, and that seed was hunger. He was hungry for control from the time he was old enough to understand that his family had none. His father worked double shifts at a manufacturing plant and came home smelling like metal and exhaustion. His mother stretched grocery budgets so thin you could see through them. They were not poor in the way that makes for dramatic stories, but they were poor in the way that leaves a permanent mark on a child's understanding of what safety means. Safety meant money. Security meant power. And weakness meant becoming his father. A man who worked himself into an early grave and left behind nothing but a modest pension and a closet full of work boots that nobody wanted. Elias decided young that he would never be weak. He would never be dependent. He would never be the man who came home smelling like someone else's profit. He worked his way through state college on scholarships and determination. He slept 4 hours a night and spent the rest studying, networking, positioning himself for opportunities that had not even appeared yet. By the time he was 30, he had founded his first biotech startup. By 40, he had sold it for more money than his father had earned in his entire lifetime. By 50, Elias Thorne had become a titan of the pharmaceutical industry, a man whose face appeared on magazine covers with headlines about innovation and humanitarian vision. His companies promised cures before diseases even had names. His research facilities employed thousands. His charitable foundations funded hospitals in developing nations, and every ribbon-cutting ceremony featured his practiced smile and his carefully rehearsed speeches about giving back. The world called him a savior. They gave him awards. They invited him to speak at conferences. They wrote profiles about his journey from humble beginnings to extraordinary success. But none of those journalists ever asked about his family. None of them pressed too hard when he changed the subject. None of them noticed how rarely he mentioned his son. Malachi Thorne came into the world fighting. His mother, Elena, had been Elias's first wife, a woman he married when ambition still had room for tenderness. She had dark skin and kind eyes and a laugh that used to make Elias feel like maybe the hunger inside him could be satisfied by something other than achievement. But that feeling faded, the way feelings do when they are not tended to, when they are left to compete with ambition for a man's attention. The marriage survived Malachi's birth, but began crumbling under the weight of his illness. The diagnosis came when Malachi was just 2 years old. Doctors first noticed that something was wrong when he caught every cold that passed through his daycare. His fevers lasted longer than they should have. His small body seemed to be at war with itself, fighting battles that healthy children never even noticed. The specialists used words that Elias had to look up later, terms like primary immunodeficiency disorder and genetic mutation and chronic management. What they meant, when all the medical language was stripped away, was that Malachi's immune system did not work properly. It could not protect him from infections the way other children's bodies could. He would need medications. He would need monitoring. He would need accommodations and patience and a kind of careful attention that did not come naturally to a man like Elias Thorne. The marriage ended when Malachi was 4. Elena could not bear watching her husband look at their son with disappointment rather than love. She filed for divorce and fought for full custody, but Elias had resources she could not match. His lawyers painted her as unstable, overwhelmed by the stress of caring for a sick child. The court granted joint custody, which meant Malachi spent half his time in his father's cold mansion and half in his mother's warm apartment. Those years with Elena were the only happiness Malachi would remember from his early childhood. She held him when the fevers came. She read to him when he was too weak to play. She told him every day that he was loved, that his illness did not define him, that he was going to grow up to do amazing things. She was the only person who made him feel like his life had value. Elena passed away when Malachi was 6. An accident, they said. Wrong place, wrong time. A truck running a red light while she was crossing the street to pick up Malachi's medication. Elias attended the funeral and stood at the back, watching his son cry in the arms of Elena's mother, and felt something that might have been guilt but was more likely inconvenience. Because now the boy was his responsibility entirely. There was no one else to handle the doctor appointments and the medication schedules and the constant vigilance that keeping Malachi alive required. There was only Elias, and Elias had companies to run. He hired nurses. He hired a full-time caregiver named Mrs. Patterson who managed the day-to-day realities of raising a sick child while Elias focused on the work that actually mattered. And for the next 2 years, this arrangement functioned well enough that Elias could pretend it was the same thing as parenting. But children are not problems to be managed. They are not tasks to be delegated. And Malachi, even sick, even quiet, even spending most of his days in bed reading picture books while other children played outside, was still a child who wanted his father to see him. Elias saw him, though. That was the problem. He saw Malachi, and what he saw made him uncomfortable in ways he could not articulate to anyone, least of all himself. Because Malachi was living proof that Elias Thorne could not fix everything. All the money, all the power, all the brilliant scientists on his payroll, and none of it could make his son healthy. Every cough that echoed through the big empty house reminded Elias that some things could not be engineered. Every time he looked at Malachi's thin arms, covered in bruises from blood draws and 4 lines, he heard a whisper that he could not silence, a whisper that said you are not God, you never were, and all your empire means nothing against the randomness of genetics. Elias hated that whisper. He hated it more than he had ever hated anything, more than he hated poverty, more than he hated weakness, more than he hated the memory of his father dying slowly in a hospital bed while the insurance company argued about coverage. And because he could not hate the whisper, he started hating the source of it. He started hating his son. He would never have called it hatred. He was not that honest with himself. He called it distance. He called it practical decision-making. He called it focusing his energy where it could make a difference. But the truth he buried so deep that even he could not see it most days, was that every time he looked at Malachi, he felt like a failure. And Elias Thorne had built his entire identity on never being a failure. So he stopped looking. He stopped visiting Malachi's room. He moved the boy to a separate wing of the house and instructed Mrs. Patterson to handle everything. He told himself this was for the boy's own good, that children needed routine and professional care, that his presence would only disrupt the careful medical protocols that kept Malachi stable. But even at 7, even at 8, Malachi understood what his father's absence meant. It meant he was not worth the time. It meant his existence was a burden. It meant that all the love he had known with his mother was something that had died with her, something that would never come back. The merger was everything Elias had worked toward for 10 years. His company, Thorne Biogenetics, was on the verge of acquiring a smaller firm that had developed breakthrough technology in gene therapy. If the deal went through, Elias would control the most promising treatment pipeline in the industry. Stock prices would surge. His board would celebrate. His legacy would be cemented as the man who brought genetic medicine into a new era. But mergers of that size required scrutiny, and scrutiny meant that every aspect of Elias's life would be examined by investors, regulators, and journalists looking for any reason to question the deal. His legal team had warned him about vulnerabilities. His public relations consultants had reminded him that perception was reality in the business world. And somewhere in those meetings, someone had mentioned Malachi. Not by name, of course. They called him a potential liability. They talked about optics, about how a billionaire with a chronically ill child might appear, about whether competitors might use that information to suggest that Thorne Biogenetics could not even heal its founder's own family. They never directly said the words, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. The boy was a problem. Elias considered his options. He could hide Malachi more completely, send him to a private facility overseas where no journalist would ever find him. He could pay for silence, threaten anyone who might talk, bury the story under layers of legal protections. But these options felt temporary, fragile, dependent on other people's cooperation. And Elias Thorne had learned long ago that depending on other people was a form of weakness. He needed a permanent solution, one that would eliminate the problem entirely while also generating sympathy rather than suspicion. He needed Malachi to disappear in a way that made Elias look like a grieving father rather than a neglectful one. The idea came to him late one night, alone in his study with a glass of whiskey and a map of protected wilderness areas. Accidents happened in those places all the time. Children wandered off trails and were never found. Families went on healing journeys and encountered tragedies that no one could have predicted. The key was to control the narrative, to be the devastated parent rather than the suspicious one. And Elias knew exactly how to control narratives. He had been doing it his entire career. He planned the trip for 2 months later, timing it to coincide with a gap in his public schedule and a period when Malachi's health had stabilized enough for travel. He dismissed Mrs. Patterson with a generous severance package and a non-disclosure agreement that would keep her silent forever. He told the remaining staff that he wanted to reconnect with his son, to give them both a chance to heal their relationship away from the pressures of daily life. He practiced saying these words in the mirror until they sounded genuine, until he could almost believe them himself. He researched the forest carefully, identifying an area where cell signals were unreliable and ranger patrols were infrequent. He prepared a story about a special place, a healing journey that would help Malachi feel better, a camping trip where they would bond like fathers and sons were supposed to bond. It was the kind of story that an 8-year-old would believe because 8-year-olds still believe their fathers love them. That belief would make him cooperate. That trust would make him obedient. And that innocent faith would be the thing that nearly killed him. They left on a Thursday morning in late September. Elias drove a rented SUV with no GPS tracking and no record connecting it to his name. Malachi sat in the back seat with a small backpack containing his favorite book, a stuffed animal his mother had given him, and a week's worth of medication that Mrs. Patterson had carefully organized before she left. The boy was excited. He had never been on a trip alone with his father. He had never seen his father smile at him the way Elias was smiling now, with warmth that seemed almost real. He chattered about the trees they passed, and asked questions about where they were going and whether they would see bears and if they could roast marshmallows over a campfire. Elias answered in short sentences, his mind focused on the task ahead, his heart closed to the small voice that kept asking for his attention. They drove for 7 hours, stopping twice at gas stations where Elias paid cash and avoided eye contact with security cameras. By late afternoon, they had reached the edge of the protected forest, a place so remote that even the road turned to gravel and then to dirt. Elias told Malachi they would camp near a stream where the air was clean and healing. He said being in nature would make Malachi stronger. He said all of this with the same practiced sincerity he used in boardrooms and television interviews, and Malachi believed every word. The boy had brought his small backpack with his essential medications, enough for 7 days. He had brought the stuffed elephant his mother had given him on his 5th birthday, the one he still slept with every night because it smelled like her perfume. He had brought a jacket that was slightly too big for him, a hand-me-down from a donation bin because no one had thought to buy him new clothes that actually fit. He had brought hope, the innocent hope that children carry even when every piece of evidence suggests they should let it go. They hiked together for an hour, Elias walking ahead and Malachi struggling to keep pace on legs that had spent too much time in hospital beds. When they reached a clearing near the stream, Elias stopped and made a show of looking around. He set up a small tent and told Malachi this would be their camp. He built a fire and heated some soup from a can and watched his son eat with the enthusiasm of a child who was finally getting what he had always wanted: time with his father. That night, after Malachi fell asleep in the tent clutching his stuffed elephant, Elias sat by the dying fire and finalized his plan. In the morning, he would tell the boy he needed to hike back to the car for more supplies. He would tell him to stay in the tent, to wait, to be brave. He would tell him someone would come. Then he would leave and drive away and report the disappearance as a tragic accident 2 days later, giving the forest enough time to do what forests do to small sick children left alone without medicine or protection. He felt nothing as he made this plan. He had trained himself to feel nothing when difficult decisions needed to be made. This was just business. This was just efficiency. This was just solving a problem that had no other solution. The morning came cold and gray. Malachi woke up with a slight fever, his body already responding to the stress of travel and exposure. Elias gave him his morning medication and made him eat some crackers even though the boy said he was not hungry. Then he knelt down and looked his son in the eyes for what he intended to be the last time. He told Malachi he needed to go back to the car because he had forgotten important supplies. He told him to stay in the tent and not wander off no matter what. He told him that if anyone came, he should tell them his father would be right back. He told him to be brave. Malachi nodded solemnly, trusting completely, believing that his father would return because fathers always return for their children. That is what fathers do. Elias stood up and walked away without looking back. He followed the trail to where he had parked the SUV and drove away as the morning mist began to lift from the forest floor. By the time the sun was fully up, he was already 2 hours away, composing the phone call he would make to authorities the following day. He would sound frantic. He would sound devastated. He would tell them about the camping trip and how his son had wandered away from the campsite while Elias was gathering firewood. He would describe searching for hours, calling the boy's name until his voice gave out. He would mention the medication, the fragile immune system, the desperate need for speed. He would play the role of terrified father perfectly, and the world would never suspect that terror was the one emotion he had never actually felt. 2 days later, search teams found the abandoned campsite. They found the small backpack with the remaining medications. They found the stuffed elephant, dropped near the stream as if the boy had tried to follow the water. They found footprints leading in multiple directions, small shoe prints that disappeared into the undergrowth. They did not find Malachi. After 3 weeks, the search was officially suspended. After 2 months, it was declared a recovery mission rather than a rescue. After 6 months, Elias Thorne held a memorial service that was covered by every major news outlet. He stood at a podium with tears in his eyes and spoke about loss and legacy and the cruelty of a world that would take a child who had already suffered so much. The merger closed 1 week later. Stock prices surged exactly as predicted. The first night alone nearly killed him. Malachi waited in the tent until the sun set and the temperature dropped, and his thin jacket could not protect him from the cold that seeped up from the ground. He called out for his father until his small voice went hoarse. He cried until there were no tears left, clutching his stuffed elephant and whispering to it that Daddy would come back. Daddy promised. Daddy would never leave him here alone. But as the hours passed and the forest sounds grew louder around him, the fever that had started that morning grew worse. His body shook with chills. His head pounded. His throat burned. He knew he was supposed to stay in the tent, but the tent was so cold and so dark, and he was so scared. He crawled out into the night, thinking maybe he could find the trail, maybe he could find the car, maybe he could find his father, and everything would be okay. He walked until he could not walk anymore. He stumbled through undergrowth that scratched his legs and arms. He fell into a stream and dragged himself out, soaking wet and shivering so hard his teeth chattered. He collapsed at the base of a large tree and curled into a ball, still holding the elephant, still waiting for someone to come. The forest was dark and full of sounds he did not understand. Animals moved through the brush. Owls called in the distance. The wind whispered through the branches like voices speaking languages he could not comprehend. He was 8 years old and alone and dying, and the last thought he had before losing consciousness was that his mother would have come back for him. His mother would never have left him here. They found him on the third day. Not search teams. Not rangers. Not the authorities his father had supposedly notified. They were 3 people walking through the forest on paths that did not appear on any official map, following trails that had been known to their families for generations. An older woman with gray hair pulled back in a braid, carrying a basket of herbs she had gathered that morning. A middle-aged man with kind eyes and hands that knew how to heal, her son who had learned medicine from her the way she had learned it from her mother. A younger woman, maybe 25, the man's daughter, who had spotted the small figure curled at the base of the tree and called out to the others. They saw the boy unconscious and burning with fever, his lips cracked and his skin pale, and they did not hesitate. They did not ask who he was or where he came from or whether helping him would create complications for their community. They simply picked him up and carried him home. The settlement was hidden deep in the forest, in a valley that satellites could not see clearly and government agencies had never bothered to investigate. About 40 people lived there, descendants of families who had retreated from the outside world generations ago, choosing to preserve old knowledge rather than participate in systems they did not trust. They grew their own food. They made their own medicine. They governed themselves according to traditions that valued connection over competition and care over conquest. To the outside world, they did not exist. To Malachi, they became everything. The woman with the gray braid was called Ruth. She had been a nurse once, in another life, 40 years ago, before she came to the forest and learned that healing involved more than just medicine. She looked at Malachi and saw immediately that his body was fighting itself, that his immune system was both his enemy and his only hope. She did not have access to the expensive drugs that pharmaceutical companies charge thousands of dollars for. She did not have laboratories or research teams or any of the resources that Elias Thorne considered essential to medicine. What she had was knowledge passed down through generations, the understanding of how plants interacted with bodies, how stress affected immunity, how touch and presence and genuine care could trigger healing responses that no pill could replicate. She also understood that this child had been abandoned, not lost. The campsite they found later told the story clearly enough. A father who had packed up and left, taking the car keys and the food, but leaving the medicine behind. She did not know the details, but she knew the shape of the wound, and she knew that healing that wound would be just as important as healing his body. The first year was the hardest. Malachi's body went through cycles of crisis and recovery, fighting infections that would have overwhelmed him in the outside world. Ruth adjusted his treatments constantly, observing how he responded to different combinations, trusting her intuition as much as her training. The man with kind eyes, whose name was Samuel and who was Ruth's son, taught Malachi breathing exercises that helped manage pain and reduce inflammation. The young woman, called Grace, who was Samuel's daughter, became like an older sister to the boy, reading to him when he was too weak to hold a book, telling him stories about the forest and the animals and the history of their community. She taught him that he was not alone, that he belonged somewhere, that people could choose to love each other even when blood did not connect them. Malachi learned to call Ruth grandmother. He learned to call Samuel uncle. He learned to call Grace sister. And slowly, the wound that his father had carved into his heart began to close. By the end of the first year, Malachi could walk without help. His fevers came less frequently. His body was learning to fight in ways that his previous doctors would have considered impossible. Ruth did not claim to have cured him. She was too honest for that. She said that his body had found a new equilibrium, that the combination of treatment and environment and reduced stress had given his system what it needed to adapt. But she also said something else, something that stayed with Malachi for the rest of his life. She said that the greatest medicine was being seen, being valued, being treated as worthy of care. She said that his father's abandonment, as terrible as it was, had brought him to people who knew how to love without conditions. That did not make what his father did right, but it meant that something good had grown from something evil. And that was worth remembering. The years passed slowly in the forest, measured not by calendar pages, but by seasons and harvests and the gradual changes in Malachi's body and mind. He grew taller. He grew stronger. He grew into a young man who carried himself with a quiet confidence that had nothing to do with wealth or status. He learned to garden and hunt, to build and repair, to contribute to a community that valued every member equally. He learned that his worth was not determined by his productivity or his health status or his potential to generate profit for someone else. His worth was inherent. It had always been inherent. He had simply been born into a world that could not see it. He also learned science. The community was not opposed to modern knowledge, only to the systems that had corrupted it. They had books, many of them, collected over decades from various sources. Textbooks on biology and chemistry, histories of medicine, research papers that members had brought with them from previous lives. Ruth herself had kept her nursing textbooks and added to them over the years with journals and publications she obtained during rare trips to the outside world. Malachi devoured all of it. He compared what he read to what Ruth taught him and found that they were not contradictory, but complementary. The best of modern science and the best of traditional healing could work together, each addressing gaps in the other. This realization became the foundation of his life's work. When Malachi was 15, Ruth gave him a new name. She said that names carried power, that the name his father had given him was tied to pain and abandonment, and that he deserved a name that reflected who he had become rather than where he came from. She suggested Malik, which meant one who has found inner authority. He accepted the name gratefully. He was no longer the sick boy left to die in the forest. He was Malik, raised by the forest, healed by love, becoming something his father never imagined possible. By 18, Malik was Ruth's primary assistant, helping her treat other members of the community, learning the subtle art of reading bodies and understanding what they needed. By 20, he had begun developing his own protocols, combining Ruth's traditional knowledge with the scientific principles he had studied in books. By 22, Ruth told him that he had learned everything she could teach him, and that the time was approaching when he would need to make a choice about his future. When he was 25, Ruth gathered the family together and told Malik that she would not live forever. She was 83 years old, still strong but aware that her time was limited. She wanted to know that her knowledge would survive, that everything she had preserved would continue to help people after she was gone. She gave him a choice. He could stay in the community forever, protected from a world that had hurt him, living a quiet life of purpose and connection. He could become the community's healer, training others the way she had trained him, ensuring that the knowledge passed to another generation. Or he could return to the outside world, carrying the wisdom he had gained, and try to change it from within. She told him that both choices were valid, that neither was better than the other, that only he could know what his path should be. She also told him that if he chose to leave, he should understand what he was returning to, a system built on profit rather than care, institutions that valued credentials over wisdom, a father who had tried to kill him and had never faced consequences. She said he should return only if he could do so without seeking revenge, because revenge would destroy him faster than any disease. Malik took 3 months to decide. He walked through the forest alone for hours at a time, thinking about everything he had experienced and everything he had lost. He thought about his mother, dead before she could see who he would become. He thought about his father, alive and celebrated, building an empire on the promise of healing while abandoning the child he should have healed himself. He thought about all the other children like him, sick and vulnerable, trapped in systems that treated them as problems to be managed rather than people to be loved. And he made his choice. He would go back, not for revenge, not to expose his father or tear down his empire. He would go back to build something better, something that integrated the wisdom he had learned with the tools modern medicine provided. He would go back because the world needed people who understood that healing was not a commodity to be sold. He would go back because he could, because he was strong enough now, because the forest had given him something his father never could, the knowledge that he was worthy of love and the ability to extend that love to others. Grace drove him to the nearest town in an old truck the community kept hidden for emergencies. She gave him money, not much, but enough to get started. She gave him documents that Ruth had obtained years ago through contacts who still lived in the outside world, identity papers under the name Malik Thorne. Ruth had anticipated this moment long before Malik himself knew it was coming. She had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything, with patience and foresight and love. Malik hugged Grace goodbye and promised to return when he could. He hugged Samuel and thanked him for being the father he should have had. He hugged Ruth last and longest, unable to find words for everything she had given him. She simply smiled and touched his face and told him to go change the world. Then he walked into town and began the long journey back to a society that believed he was dead. The outside world was overwhelming after 17 years in the forest. The noise and the speed and the constant stimulation made his head spin. Everything moved so fast. People stared at screens instead of looking at each other. Conversations happened through devices rather than face-to-face. The air smelled different, heavy with exhaust and chemicals that made his lungs ache after years of breathing forest air. But Malik adapted, the way he had always adapted, by paying attention and learning quickly and trusting his own judgment. He enrolled in a GED program first, needing official credentials before he could pursue higher education. The tests were easy. He had been studying for 17 years, absorbing knowledge from every book the community possessed. Within 6 months, he had his high school equivalency and was applying to community colleges. He chose a small school in a rural area, somewhere quiet where he could ease back into society without being overwhelmed. He tested out of basic courses and advanced rapidly through subjects that fascinated him. His professors noticed him immediately. Here was a student who asked questions they had never considered, who connected ideas across disciplines in ways that revealed deep understanding. He was older than most of his classmates, 26 by the time he started college, but his age became an advantage. He had perspective they lacked. He had patience. He had a clarity of purpose that made every assignment feel meaningful rather than arbitrary. He transferred to a university after 2 years, earning scholarships based on his academic performance rather than his family connections. He studied biology and traditional medicine simultaneously, writing papers that bridged the two fields in ways that caught the attention of professors who had never seen anyone approach the subjects from his angle. He kept a low profile throughout his education. He did not use social media. He did not speak publicly about his past. When people asked about his background, he said he had grown up in a rural community with limited resources, which was true enough. He said his parents were gone, which was also true in every way that mattered. He said he had learned medicine from elders who trusted observation over institution. People found this charming, inspiring even. Nobody suspected that he was the dead son of a billionaire. Nobody connected the quiet graduate student with the tragic news story from 17 years ago. Elias Thorne's lost son had been 8 years old when he disappeared. Malik was a grown man with a different first name and a completely different bearing. The connection was invisible unless you knew to look for it. By 30, Malik had completed medical school, finishing at the top of his class despite entering the program years older than most of his peers. By 33, he had completed a specialized fellowship in immunology, focusing on genetic immune disorders and integrated treatment approaches. His research combined pharmaceutical intervention with lifestyle modifications, stress reduction, community support, and traditional healing practices that mainstream medicine had largely ignored. Clinical trials showed significantly better outcomes for patients treated with his integrated methods. Other researchers began citing his work. Invitations to speak at conferences arrived regularly. He accepted some of them, carefully choosing audiences where his ideas might find fertile ground. He built a network of collaborators who shared his vision of medicine as partnership rather than domination. And slowly, quietly, he began to attract the attention of people with resources, people who wanted to fund his research, people who saw in his work the future of healthcare. He thought about his father sometimes. Not often, but sometimes. He read articles about Thorne biogenetics and its continued expansion. He saw photographs of Elias accepting awards and shaking hands with politicians. He watched interviews where his father spoke eloquently about innovation and compassion and the importance of making medicine accessible to everyone. The hypocrisy should have enraged him. Instead, it made him sad. His father had become so lost in his own mythology that he probably believed his own lies. He probably genuinely thought he was a good person, a humanitarian, a man who cared about healing. The truth that Malik carried in his bones, was that Elias Thorne cared about nothing except power and control. The healing was just a story he told to make the power more palatable. Malik did not hate his father. Hatred would have required too much energy, too much attention focused on someone who did not deserve it. He simply observed his father from a distance, the way a scientist observes a specimen, noting behaviors and patterns without emotional investment. 25 years after his abandonment in the forest, Malik received an invitation that made his stomach tighten with emotions he had worked hard to transcend. The Global Health Innovation Council was presenting its highest honor to Thorne Biogenetics for breakthrough treatments in genetic immune disorders. The ceremony would be broadcast worldwide. The award would be accepted by Elias Thorne personally, and the keynote speaker, the scientist whose research had made the breakthrough possible, would be Dr. Malik Thorne. They did not know. How could they know? He had built his career under a name just different enough to avoid automated connections. He had never publicly discussed his childhood or his family. The research he conducted had been attributed to his own genius, not to any connection with the company now being honored. When the invitation arrived, Malik understood that someone at Thorne Biogenetics had licensed his published protocols without realizing who had developed them. They had taken his work and integrated it into their commercial products, the way pharmaceutical companies always did with promising research. They were now being celebrated for innovations that had originated in the mind of the son Elias Thorne had left to die. Malik could have declined the invitation. He could have exposed the situation privately, contacted lawyers, made demands for credit and compensation. He could have gone to journalists with his story and destroyed his father's reputation in a single news cycle. Any of these responses would have been justified. But Ruth's voice echoed in his memory, the last conversation they had before she passed away 3 years ago, warning him about the cost of revenge, reminding him that becoming his father's destroyer would only make him more like his father. So he accepted the invitation. He would attend the ceremony. He would deliver his keynote address. He would stand on that stage and let his father see what the forest had made of the boy he had discarded. And then he would walk away, leaving Elias to live with the knowledge of what he had done. That would be punishment enough. That would be more than enough. The ceremony took place in a grand hotel ballroom in a city of glass towers and important people. Malik wore a simple suit that fit well but made no statement. He arrived early and sat in the back, watching as guests filtered in, executives and investors and healthcare leaders who had no idea about the drama about to unfold. Elias arrived with an entourage, silver-haired now and approaching 80, but still commanding attention, still radiating the confidence of a man who believed his own mythology. He shook hands and smiled for photographers and accepted congratulations as if he personally had developed every treatment his company sold. Malik watched him and felt something surprising. Not anger, not hatred, just a profound sadness for the man his father had become, a man so hollow that applause was the only thing that could fill him. The ceremony began. Speeches were made. Statistics were cited. The impact of Thorne Biogenetics on global health outcomes was praised in language that bordered on worship. Then the moment arrived. The presenter, a distinguished woman in an elegant dress, stepped to the microphone with a smile that had been practiced for cameras. She spoke about innovation and vision and the importance of recognizing not just companies, but the individuals whose brilliance drove progress forward. She thanked Elias Thorne for his decades of leadership. And then she said the words that changed everything. And now, the scientist whose research made this breakthrough possible, the pioneer whose integrated approach has transformed treatment protocols worldwide. Please welcome Dr. Malik Thorne. The name hung in the air. Elias, seated in the front row with his entourage, went completely still. His face did not change expression because his public face never changed expression. But something in his eyes shifted, something that looked like recognition fighting against impossibility. Malik walked to the stage slowly, deliberately, giving his father time to process what he was seeing. He was 33 years old now, a grown man with broad shoulders and a calm presence. Nothing like the frail 8-year-old Elias had left to die in the forest. But the eyes were the same. Elena's eyes. The eyes Elias had once loved before he forgot how to love anything. Malik reached the podium and adjusted the microphone and looked out at the audience with the peace that 25 years of healing had given him. He thanked the organizers. He thanked his collaborators. He thanked the patients who had trusted him with their care and taught him that medicine was about people, not products. He spoke about his research methodology, about the importance of treating patients as whole human beings rather than collections of symptoms. He spoke about the communities that had preserved traditional knowledge for generations, knowledge that mainstream medicine was only beginning to appreciate. He spoke about Ruth, without naming her, the healer who had shown him that the greatest medicine was presence and care and unconditional love. And then, just before he concluded, he turned slightly toward where his father sat. Their eyes met. Malik saw panic there, barely concealed behind decades of practiced composure. He saw the calculations running, the assessment of threats, the weighing of options. He saw a man who had never learned to feel anything real looking at the living consequence of his greatest crime. And Malik smiled. Not cruelly, not triumphantly, just the smile of a man who had found peace and was offering that peace as a gift to someone who could not possibly receive it. Sometimes, Malik said, looking directly at Elias, healing comes from where we are abandoned. Sometimes the places we are left to die become the places where we learn to live. I am grateful for every teacher who showed me that medicine is not about power. It is about presence. It is about staying when leaving would be easier. It is about seeing the humanity in every patient, especially the ones the system wants to discard. Thank you. The audience applauded. They did not understand the full meaning of his words. They thought they were hearing a general philosophy, not a personal accusation. But Elias understood. Elias understood everything. He sat frozen in his seat while people around him clapped and smiled, while the ceremony continued to its conclusion, while photographers captured images of a moment that would later be analyzed for clues. He understood that his son was alive. He understood that his son had somehow survived and thrived and become exactly the kind of man Elias had always wanted to be. And he understood that his son had chosen not to expose him, not because he could not, but because he did not need to. The silence was worse than any accusation. The silence said, I have moved beyond you. The silence said, you cannot hurt me anymore. The silence said, I am free and you never will be. The ceremony ended. Guests moved to a reception area for drinks and networking. Elias remained seated, unable to make his body respond to commands that had always come automatically. His handlers noticed something was wrong. They surrounded him with concerned faces and quiet questions. Are you feeling unwell? Should we call a doctor? Do you need to leave? He could not answer them. He could only watch as Malik moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations, shaking hands, engaging with people who had no idea they were speaking to a ghost. Eventually, Elias found his feet. He excused himself from his entourage with a muttered explanation about needing air. He followed his son through the crowd, keeping distance, watching for an opportunity. He did not know what he would say. He had never planned for this possibility because he had never believed this possibility existed. But he needed to say something, to explain, to find words that could undo 25 years of consequence. He caught up with Malik in a quiet hallway away from the reception. For a long moment, they simply stood there, father and son, looking at each other across a distance that had nothing to do with physical space. Malik spoke first. I wondered if you would come find me. Elias opened his mouth, but nothing came out. All the speeches he had given, all the presentations he had mastered, and now he could not form a single sentence. How he finally managed. His voice sounded strangled, unfamiliar even to himself. How are you alive? Malik leaned against the wall, relaxed, as if they were discussing something trivial. The forest was kinder than you expected. There were people there. They found me. They healed me. They raised me. Elias shook his head, trying to process information that did not fit into any framework he understood. That is impossible. Your immune system. Without medication. You should have been dead within days. Malik nodded. By every measure your science uses, yes. I should have been dead. But your science does not measure everything. It does not measure community. It does not measure care. It does not measure the will to survive when someone finally shows you that your life has value. I had all of those things. They turned out to be more powerful than any drug you could have manufactured. Silence stretched between them. Elias felt something cracking inside himself, some wall he had built so long ago that he had forgotten it existed. He wanted to apologize. He wanted to explain. He wanted to find words that could somehow make what he had done less monstrous. But every possible sentence died before it reached his lips because there were no words for what he had done. There was no explanation that could justify abandoning an 8-year-old child to die alone. There was no apology that could undo 25 years of absence. I was 8 years old, Malik said quietly. 8. I still believed you would come back. I waited in that tent calling for you until my voice gave out. I walked through the forest looking for you until I collapsed. I almost died believing that my father loved me and would never abandon me. And you drove away. You went back to your life. You held a memorial service where you cried in front of cameras. You used my death to close your business deal. Elias flinched at each sentence as if being struck. He had never heard these facts stated so plainly. He had never been forced to stand in front of the consequence of his actions and absorb its full weight. He started, then stopped. He was going to say he was under pressure. He was going to say he was not thinking clearly. He was going to say something that shifted responsibility, that made his choice seem less deliberate than it was. But looking at his son, he found he could not lie anymore. The lies had worked on everyone else. They did not work here. Finally, Malik spoke again. I am not here for revenge. I want you to understand that. I could destroy you tonight if I chose to. One press conference. One DNA test. Your entire legacy would crumble. Every award would be reconsidered. Every tribute would become evidence of hypocrisy. You would spend your final years in courtrooms and scandals and the judgment of a world that currently worships you. But that would require me to make you the center of my life again. And I have spent 25 years learning that you do not deserve that position. So I am going to leave now. I am going to continue building the work that actually matters. And you are going to live with knowing what you did and what I became despite you. That is the only justice I need. He pushed away from the wall and straightened his jacket. I thought about you sometimes over the years. I wondered if you ever felt guilt. I wondered if you ever woke up at night thinking about the boy you left in the forest. But looking at you now, I do not think you did. I think you told yourself a story that made you the victim somehow, the grieving father who lost his son to tragedy. You probably believe that story. You probably have repeated it so many times that the truth has faded completely. That is the saddest part of all of this. You cannot even see what you did. Goodbye, Elias. I hope you find whatever it is you have been looking for. I hope it was worth what you paid. Then Malik walked away. He did not look back. He did not hesitate. He moved through the reception area and out the front doors of the hotel and into a night that was cool and clear and full of possibilities. Behind him, Elias Thorne stood alone in a hallway, surrounded by the echoes of his own choices, finally understanding the price of the empire he had built. 6 months later, Malik announced the founding of the Thorne Institute for Integrated Medicine. The name was deliberate, a reclamation rather than an inheritance. The institute would focus on developing treatment protocols that combined modern pharmaceutical science with traditional healing practices. It would train doctors to see patients as whole people rather than symptom clusters. It would partner with indigenous communities worldwide to preserve and validate traditional medical knowledge. It would provide free care to children with chronic illnesses whose families could not afford treatment. Funding came from sources that had nothing to do with Elias's empire, investors who believed in Malik's vision and wanted to be part of something transformative. The announcement generated significant media attention. Journalists tried to connect the new institute to Thorne Biogenetics, assuming some corporate relationship or family lineage. Malik addressed these questions directly in his launch statement. He acknowledged that he shared a name with the famous company, but stated clearly that he had no connection to its leadership or its values. He said he had built his approach to medicine in opposition to the profit-driven model that dominated healthcare. He said he believed healing should be accessible to everyone, not just those who could afford expensive treatments. The statement was widely praised. It was also carefully designed to reveal nothing about his actual history. Elias watched all of this from the mansion that now felt like a prison. He had stepped down from his position as CEO immediately after the ceremony, citing health reasons that were not entirely false. The shock of seeing his son alive had triggered something in his body, chest pains and shortness of breath that his personal physicians attributed to stress. The board thanked him for his decades of service and threw him a lavish retirement party that felt like a funeral. He sat through the speeches and the toasts and wondered what any of it had meant. He had all the money he could ever spend. He had all the recognition he had ever craved. And he had nothing that mattered. His son was alive and thriving and wanted nothing to do with him. His legacy was being quietly overshadowed by someone who actually understood what healing meant. He was approaching 80 years old, and he was going to die alone, surrounded by people who only valued him for what he had given them, never for who he was. He tried to reach Malik several times over the following years. Letters returned unopened. Emails went unanswered. Phone calls routed to assistants who politely declined to connect him. He considered going public with the truth himself, confessing everything, accepting whatever punishment the world wanted to give him. But he was too cowardly even for that. He could not bear to see the looks on people's faces when they learned what he had done. He could not bear to have his carefully constructed image shattered. So he stayed silent and watched from a distance as his son changed the world without him. The Thorn Institute grew rapidly, opening branches in 12 countries within 5 years. Its training programs graduated thousands of doctors who practiced medicine differently than they had been taught in traditional schools. Its research publications influenced policy at the highest levels. Malik became an international figure, interviewed by major publications, invited to advise governments, recognized as one of the most important medical innovators of his generation. And in every interview, when asked about his family, he simply said that the people who raised him had taught him everything he knew about healing. He never mentioned his father. He never acknowledged that Elias Thorn existed. Let me ask you something. If you were Malik, could you have walked away without seeking revenge? Could you have stood on that stage, looked your father in the eye, and chosen peace instead of destruction? Most people say they would have exposed him. Most people say they would have wanted the world to know what Elias Thorn had done, and maybe they would have been justified in that choice. But Malik understood something that vengeance does not teach, that destroying someone else does not heal what they broke in you, that making them suffer does not undo your own suffering, that the best revenge is not revenge at all. The best revenge is building a life so full of meaning that the person who hurt you becomes irrelevant. And if you were Elias? If you were the one who had made those choices, who had convinced yourself that abandoning your 8-year-old sick child was somehow necessary for your success, could you live with the silence that followed? Could you watch your son become everything you claimed to value while knowing you had tried to kill him? Could you accept that the empire you built was worth less than the relationship you destroyed? These are not comfortable questions. They are not meant to be. They are meant to make you look at your own life and ask what you might be sacrificing for things that do not actually matter. They are meant to make you wonder what forgotten relationships might be waiting for your attention, what healing might be possible if you chose connection over ambition. Some people will watch this story and think about their own fathers, the ones who were present and the ones who were absent, the ones who chose them and the ones who chose something else. Some people will think about their own children, wondering if small neglects might grow into larger wounds over time. Some people will think about their own abandoned selves, the parts they left behind because someone told them those parts were not valuable enough to keep. Wherever this story touches you, let it touch you fully. Do not push away the discomfort. That discomfort is trying to show you something. It is trying to remind you that we are all connected, that our choices ripple outward in ways we cannot predict, that love is the only thing that truly survives us. Tell us in the comments what you would have done. Tell us whether you think Malik's choice was wisdom or weakness. Tell us what this story made you feel and what it made you remember about your own life. Because stories like this are not just entertainment. They are mirrors. They show us things about ourselves that we might not otherwise see. And the comments section is where we process those reflections together, where we learn from each other's perspectives and realize that we are not as alone as we sometimes feel. If this story stayed with you after the screen fades, if you found yourself thinking about Malik's journey or Elias's emptiness or the people who saved a dying boy because that is simply what people should do, then subscribe to this channel. We do not just tell stories here. We explore what it means to be human, in all its difficulty and all its grace. We look at the choices people make and ask what we can learn from them. We remind each other that it is never too late to choose differently, to reach out to someone we have neglected, to build something meaningful instead of something impressive. The next story will challenge you just as deeply. The next story will make you question things you thought you understood. The next story will stay with you long after you finish watching. But you will only see it if you subscribe and turn on notifications. Do that now, while you are still feeling this one. And then go tell someone you love them. Go repair something you broke. Go become the person you wish someone had been for you. Because that is how healing actually works. Not through revenge. Not through accumulation. Through presence. Through connection. Through the simple radical choice to care about someone other than yourself. Thank you for staying until the end. Thank you for being part of this community. And thank you for carrying this story forward into whatever comes next.